You know, the interesting thing to me is that if water and its conductivity is increased, that we're a very high percentage of water, I think.
90% in some organs, like blood, and other organs it's maybe 80 or 70%, but that's very high.
So if that's what's going on with water outside of the body, one would assume that that's what's going on with
Yeah,
the
right.
water
Inside.
internally as
Right,
well.
right. It's kind of hard to open people up and get access to their water. I mean, you could use saliva or blood because that's a lot of water there, but then you have to get rid of all the chemicals and the biochemicals and the nutrients and the minerals and the electrolytes because they absorb energy as well. And that's one of the, I've been testing the effects of subtle energies on different kinds of water, and in fact, water with a lot of minerals is not as effective at absorbing subtle energy, probably because the minerals absorb the energy and the water does not. It leaves less of it to for the water to absorb. So that's one of the first conclusions I've been able to draw from the experiments. The other conclusions are, as I said earlier, that different geometries affect the water in a different way, but they all increased conductivity. All of Greg's geometries increase the conductivity. I can't say that about all the other forms of subtle energy I've worked with. In fact, some forms of subtle energy inhibit the conductivity and make the flow of energy less efficient. And assumedly, that's not as good for the body because we do know that conductivity and flow of electrons is very important. That goes back to the researcher Svent Georgi, uh, 50, 75 years ago or something. I mean, he first brought the whole idea of electron transfer processes in water and biological systems is very important. So now we do know that increasing the conductivity is better than decreasing it, and some technologies increase it and some decrease it.
You know, another interesting thing to me is when you first started working with our aquarium pyramid and measuring how a geometry, how a shape would have an effect on DNA without human intervention. And of course, at that time, you were measuring what was going on with healers and their bringing their focus and their intent to DNA. And you found that a healer that was sending energy into DNA could increase the winding or unwinding of the DNA. So obviously, human consciousness has an effect on DNA
And water.
and water. But the interesting thing to me was that separate from human consciousness, I mean, outside of you just bringing a form in and without having any sense of what's going to happen, you measure what's going on with the DNA, you measure what's going on with the water, just being in proximity to a form or being inside a form with the case of the DNA. And you're going to be doing some more research with some of our forms right now with the motor and so forth. But to have a form, a geometry affecting DNA, to have consciousness affecting DNA, to begin with, a lot of people go, huh? A form, a geometry has an effect on DNA without any special interaction?
Yeah, it turns out that's right. Geometric patterns do resonate, generate an energy which resonates with water. Remember the old pyramid story? I mean, a pyramid, they used to say pyramids could actually affect the metal in a shape, in a
Razor blade.
razor blade. So we're talking about affecting the atomic structure of matter, in this case, physical matter. In that case, in the present case, with my research, it's liquid matter or liquid water. But either way, it's matter. And yes, indeed, these energies associated with these geometries do resonate with water, do affect the electrical properties of water, and it can be measured scientifically, reproducibly, and does add a hell of a lot of credibility to Greg's research. And stay tuned, because next time we'll talk about the effects on DNA.
But one more thing I just wanted to say with all of that, when you have um, a human being's intent, and some human beings do better than others because they've learned to focus their intent.
Right.
But then when you have geometry also having an effect,
Right.
when you meld the two, when you know, like some of the pendants that we have that you've experienced and worked with as well, and had that sense of having that energy on your body, when you bring those two together, when you bring intent and geometry, one would think that that could have an accumulative effect on whatever it is you're working on.
And the next series of experiments that I do, I would like to address that specific question, but you guys all probably have figured it out. It's hard to do those experiments because, you know, Greg says, "Oh yeah, well you put the geometry there and you don't focus my intention." Well, my intention is part of the experiment, and Greg's intention is part of the making of the geometric patterns in the first place. So it's very hard to separate the matter from the energy, the shape from the from the consciousness. But there are ways to do it. We've been brainstorming about how to actually do that in the laboratory. But at this point, we can certainly say that both consciousness and geometric patterns affect DNA and water. What happens when you mix the two together? Stay tuned.
You know, the other thing that we were having a problem with trying to figure out today is to work with some water, and you were asking me, well, what's the field of this form? And actually, the field of some of these forms on these geometry goes out hundreds, thousands, potentially has an effect in miles. And actually, what we found with some pieces, if you work with your intent to bring it into relationship with Mother Earth, I mean, we're starting to affect the grid of the planet, because that's the level of connection we're able to demonstrate with working with geometries that give us that higher dimensional vibrational access point to the Earth itself. And once we're in her system, it starts magnifying around the planet in waves, so that it's hard to have a it's hard to have a control that gets affected even when it's within miles
It
of
does.
what you're doing.
It does. The control is affected, and we were talking about that earlier today. The effects that I'm seeing are strong enough so that even though the control is also being affected, it's affected less than the treated sample, because the treated sample is closer, although some would say distance doesn't matter, size doesn't matter, shape does matter. And therefore, the difference between the treated and the untreated would be even larger if I brought the control several miles away from the laboratory where the water is being treated by the shape. And those are experiments that are hard to do, just impractical to do, but would if we could do it that way, then the effects that I'm observing would be even larger.
Because the control
Would be even less. Exactly.
So here we are, we're playing, we're having fun with energy, and all for the purpose in the end of, when I was talking about consciousness, it's really an expansion beyond what goes on with mental capabilities, but it's the expansion of the human being into their full multi-dimensional nature.
Which is something maybe in my next lifetime I'll figure out how to measure. But at this point, with the science, limited science that we have in the 21st century, it's a little hard to measure that.
Well, however, the nice thing is we can experience it,
Yeah, absolutely.
and it especially resonates in the heart
That's where you feel it.
as love.
Right. And every time I ask the DNA, how did you feel after being treated by one of these subtle energy devices, I always get back the same answer. Pretty much the same answer that Greg just said. Oh, I feel it in my heart.
Really? From the DNA?
Well, it's a little bit from the DNA with a little bit of imagination.
Okay. So, thank you for joining us today, and blessings.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.